Hello. Um, well, welcome. It's lovely to see you all. Some people I've seen a lot more than others, but it's a pleasure to be here. What we're here today to talk about is that we are in the process of a gambling review, which has been a long time coming. The 2005 Gambling Act is woefully out of date. It's an analog piece of legislation in a digital era, and there's some people on this call who have spent a lot of time over the last few years working to make sure we're in a position where we can put forward an alternative blueprint, if you like, about how we can make the changes we need to gambling legislation so that it doesn't spoil the fun of those who are able to actually gamble responsibly and carefully and walk away having not lost their homes, their livelihood, their dignity, and in some cases their lives. But for those vulnerable people who are not able to control their gambling, and these are the people who the industry is making huge amount of money off, and it's these people that we need to protect. So I've been looking at this for a long time with Matt Cousin and with James Noyles. 5 years nearly, I think we've been, well, gone 5 years we've been looking at this, and it wasn't a subject that I naturally came to. I have never been one who's I didn't have any opinion on gambling really until Matt started telling me about some of the harms within fixed odds betting terminals, and then we sort of evolved into where we are now. So I'm very honoured to be asked to chair this. I'm not sure if Seema's on here. I can't see Seema. So I'm presuming I'm going straight to Matt, is it?
Seema is just joining now and she can stay with us till 1:30.
Okay, so should we go with Matt first, then Seema? Okay,
that's fine. That's fine.
Matt, over to you to give some background on where we are and what we need to do.
Thanks very much, Carolyn, and thanks for the invitation to this panel. I've been campaigning for gambling reform for about eight years now, and obviously worked very closely with Carolyn on the campaign against fixed odds betting terminals, and really that was, I think, quite a seminal moment in how gambling-related harm was perceived, because prior to that campaign and the success of that campaign and getting the stake reduced to £2 a spin, gambling-related harm was always seen as kind of just really the consequence of particular like faulty individuals. Almost, it was people who were people who couldn't gamble responsibly because there was something wrong with them. They were vulnerable, all this sort of stuff. And I think since then there's been an understanding in government and really I think across political parties that gambling related harm is induced or exacerbated by some of the gambling products and practices of the industry. And what we're wanting to do in this gambling review is make the product safer. There's a principle in the 2005 Gambling Act of controls on stakes and prizes on machines. And obviously there weren't adequate controls on fixed odds betting terminals because the maximum stake was £100. There was a mechanism to reduce that, which is what happened. And really those principles now need to be applied to the same products online. Online, there are no limits to how much you can bet on slots. It's exactly the same content, but it's accessible any time of the day in any venue. So it makes absolutely no sense. It shows how out of date the legislation is, that maximum unlimited stakes are permitted on these types of products. And these types of products have very high rates of addiction and harm associated with them. So for online slots, people who are addicted or at risk constitute between 45 and 50% of the player base, which is incredibly high. It shows that the type of gambling can impact a person's gambling style. So therefore there needs to be certain controls on products that are more addictive. And those don't exist at the moment. Equally, and I know that James Noyes has done a lot of work on this, so I'll leave him to talk about this in more detail, but there's not adequate affordability checks, so people can lose unlimited amounts. I think there's also something that needs to be done about how research, education and treatment is funded. At the moment, it's funded through voluntary contributions from the industry to GambleAware and to really projects and charities that the industry approves of, which is obviously means it's very difficult to get independent research and to get adequate treatment that's got NHS involvement and is joined up across the country. So that's definitely something that needs to be addressed. There's no consumer-facing ombudsman. So, for example, if you have a problem with an operator, if an operator hasn't paid out, if they're treating you unfairly, if they've tried to get you to gamble when they know you're addicted and self-excluded and signed you up to VIP schemes, which is what they do, to offer you bonuses and inducements and trips abroad and things like that. I mean, that's some of the tactics that they use for people that they know are addicted. If you have been through that and you feel like that's that's not a fair way to treat people who have got an addiction, there's nowhere to really go to complain, to try to get redress for that kind of behavior and that kind of harassment, which I think is what a lot of these VIP schemes amount to, is harassing people with gambling addictions. So there is the Gambling Commission. We think the Gambling Commission is obviously it's the regulator. It's in charge of making sure that the operators are abiding their license conditions, basically. But there's no real mechanism to give consumers redress. So we'd like to see an ombudsman. We'd like to see advertising restricted, and we think that there is a case to end all gambling advertising because of the public health impact. But I think it's really seeing gambling as a public health issue that is so important. Everything has to be viewed through that lens, that anyone is vulnerable to gambling related harm. These are addictive products. They can do a great deal of harm, and the industry's business model at the moment derives 60% of the profits from the 5% of people who are addicted or at risk. So it is a business model that is based on people losing more than they can afford. And we think that can change. That can change with the right regulation, with the right reforms, and obviously a reorientation away from the 2005 Gambling Act, which was a liberalising piece of legislation, and now updating it with our improved knowledge, vastly improved knowledge of gambling addiction and how it's caused, to more of a public health focused piece of legislation, which is what we're hoping out of this review. And I've talked for too long already, so I'll leave it there.
You never talk for too long, Matt, ever. I know Seema Malhotra's joined us, and she's not going to be able to stay very long. So I'm going to go over to Seema now to get some words of wisdom from Seema, who's a parliamentary colleague of mine, and then we'll come to you, James. So Seema.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Look, I just want to just thank you and to thank Ibrahim and SMEs for Labour for putting on this event today. It really struck me when Ibrahim asked me to speak, and I was looking also, reviewing the work that you've been doing, Carolyn, and a huge thank you to you for that, both through the Labour campaign for gambling reform, but also through the APPG on gambling harms. It's really important, and this debate is really important, because what it will help do is put a Labour slant with Labour values and a Labour view onto this issue, which, whilst it's also very important that it's cross-party, we will come through with our own views as well. Look, I'm not sure whether Matt has covered this, but the House of Lords Gambling Industry Committee did publish, obviously, a very important report that I'm sure that you've had sight of and started to discuss some of those findings. But it is staggering that 1/3 of us are up, we see them as problem gamblers. With the suicide rates that we see, that the way in which young people are picking up those behaviours very early, even as young as age 11, that it's an issue for girls as well as for, gambling is an issue for girls as well as boys, and for boys the rate being 3 times the rate for adults. We don't often think about gambling as a sort of child safety and child safeguarding related issue either. And where adverts are seen and how they're seen, all of these issues, it isn't just adults who have got gambling problems that are impacted, it's children and habits that are formed that can be much harder to disrupt if they become formed at a very young age. So there's a real sense in which the harm, both online and offline, has got to be addressed and thought about in a different way, with that lens of well-being and safeguarding and early start, healthy early start, mental well-being, that also has to be looked at. And when you also see that for problem gamblers, the impact on families is enormous, whether that's dealing with employment and much more. I'll relate one case study from my own constituency, a sort of, in fact, someone who lives on my road. Just a devastating story that she told me of her husband when he had lost or been cheated basically with a partner, totally destroyed both his trust in others as well, how he then felt that he had to find some way to recover the money that he had been cheated out of and lost, how that led to him gambling and led to him hiding the gambling, how he then gambled much of the family from his wife, how it got utterly out of control and it destroyed him mentally. And by the time the family found out, how much harder it was to deal with this, and then to deal with somebody who had been so lively, healthy, the head of the others, and how when he died, and he died sort of fairly recently, it was a sort of knock-on consequence of the health impacts that gambling had had and how it destroyed him. So this is an issue that has consequences much more beyond the individual, and we must see this issue in that light. I know the Labour Party has also welcomed the long-promised gambling review that was launched by the government, and our aim is that it should be fit-for-purpose legislation. It's the Labour Party also that had challenged the government to make that consultation as robust as possible. We know it's launched in December, but encourage all of those who may have a perspective through the community or through their business to be contributing to that call for evidence that closes in a couple of months at the end of March. And the Labour Party has also talked about a public health approach to minimising the harm caused by problem gambling, and that consumers should be entitled to those protections that are there in other industries, online and offline. But what's also important is to hear the voice of industries that have had connection with gambling, whether that's sports clubs that have had sponsorship and other relationships. We're hearing those voices, making sure that they are also consulted and engaged with at this time, so that when we see and we come through, we've got a very kind of robust evidence base that is going to lead into where the future legislation needs to go. The APPG has also, I think, had a very important voice in this. A report last July that also has been, I think, contributing as well to what's increasingly important through the COVID period, because the period of lockdown and the impact of COVID hasn't ended. We may be going in fits and starts and lurching from one crisis to the other with the government, utterly woeful planning ahead and thinking through some of the crisis points, the cliff edges. But the situation for families is going to be longer lasting than that. And the impact on employment, the consequent drop in income, the turning to gambling, both to either deal with being able to find some other sources of income, as people always hope that they'll have that win, but also to deal with the mental well-being and depression. And sometimes gambling can be attractive for those who just want a quick sort of buzz as well. So it's complex, it's difficult as an issue to deal with. It's important, and it's increasingly vital because many more vulnerable families and individuals are going to be exposed to gambling. And also to make sure that we look at how the impact of COVID on children and their isolation may be drawing them as well into gambling as a way to deal with, creating some entertainment and also the idea that they might win, particularly where their families have seen lower incomes during COVID and the rise in child poverty. So I will leave it there, just to say a thank you again to Carolyn for all that she has done and led on this debate in the party and across Parliament. And she knows that she has my support for the work that she's doing. My thanks as well to SMEs for Labour for bringing this together, because small businesses' voices have to be heard. And it's vital that we see SMEs for Labour grow so that the voices of small enterprises, wherever they're doing, wherever they are in our communities, are at the heart of Labour's thinking as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seema. Very wise words, and thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you. Our next speaker is someone who spent most of the last few years, I imagine, knowing James, every waking moment, if I know James, actually engrossed in trying to come up with some strategies to make this situation a lot better. James is one of the most intelligent and articulate men that I've ever met, but he's a man with an excellent heart, and that's what makes the difference about this. That's the big thing about this. Everybody who I know involved in this is doing it for those of us who are not affected by the curse, because it is a curse. We do it because we got good hearts, and for those of us who have been affected by it, they do it to save other people from getting into this situation. So on that note, Dr. Professor knows everything there is to know about everything. James Noyes.
Thank you, Carolyn. I know that I don't deserve those kind words. For anyone who doesn't know about my background, I'm a senior fellow at the Social Market Foundation, which is a cross-party think tank based in Westminster. And I used to be the advisor in this area to Tom Watson when he was Shadow Culture Secretary. So played a part in trying to shape the Labour Party's policy agenda ahead of the general election in terms of gambling reform. So I wanted to give you a sort of global view of some of my thinking over the last few years and why I think gambling reform is important, particularly to the Labour Party. I think we have to start with the question, how should Labour respond to the government's gambling review? I think when asking this question, it's important that we remind ourselves of something from the outset, that the agenda of this gambling review is being led by a Conservative government, but the review itself is very much the legacy of the Labour Party. And I don't say that to score a cheap party political point. Gambling reform is a broad church and has always attracted genuine cross-bench support. We see that most importantly in Carolyn's APPG and the work that she does with Ian Duncan-Smith, Ronnie Cowan of the SNP, Richard Holden. And in my own work in the past, I've collaborated with Conservative parliamentarians and policymakers, for example, Lord Chadlington. One of the most exciting voices in the debate at the moment is a Liberal Democrat peer, Lord Foster. So when I say that this review is the legacy of the Labour Party, I don't say it to exclude the importance of the work of others, but rather to recognise something which I think is of central importance to our discussion today, that this review carries all the spots and the stripes of Labour. It was brought into being thanks to the work of people like Carolyn and Tom Watson. Almost every single one of the policy positions in the terms of reference of the review can be traced back to the interventions made by these Labour Party MPs. And so maybe today's question might be reframed to be not so much how should Labour respond to the government's review, as if it's a sort of distant or alien thing being done by other people, another party, but rather how can Labour ensure that this government review upholds and maintains Labour's legacy? And answering that question, I suppose it's useful to go back to first principles. Why should the Labour Party care about gambling at all? What is it specifically about gambling and the question of gambling reform which should be of interest not just to a broad church, but specifically to the politics of the Labour Party itself? In trying to answer that question, I go back in my mind to when gambling became something at the forefront of my own political thinking. And if you'd allow me, I'll just give three brief anecdotes, personal anecdotes that made me aware of that global picture. The first was a few years ago at a launch in Parliament by a charity called Gambling with Lives, founded by two wonderful people called Liz and Charles Ritchie, who represent families that have been bereaved by gambling-related suicide. And I will never forget, this was at the beginning of my tenure with Tom Watson, standing in that room in Parliament, and one of the mothers of one of the boys, the young man that lost his life, talking to me. And as she spoke, she held on to my arm and began to cry as she spoke to me about the loss that she'd had. And I didn't know what to do. I was obviously very uncomfortable on a human level, and I wanted to hug her and show human sympathy. But I knew that more important than my sympathy, there was something about the legislation and the regulation at stake, that if I had a role to play, if I could do some small good in this world, it was to try and make sure that a mother like that would never again be crying in the House of Parliament in front of some random policy advisor about the bereavement that she'd suffered. Second anecdote, when I first started doing research on this question, I remember how shocked and appalled I was at reading the evidence that fixed odd betting terminals were disproportionately clustered in areas of economic deprivation. Couldn't believe what I was reading. And the first time I met Matt's Zard cousin, I saw this firsthand. We went to East London, to Newham, and we walked up that long street in East Ham and counted the number of betting shops and went into them and looked at the people that were spending money on these machines. These were not people engaged in what the lobbyists like to call a harmless flutter or a leisure bet. These were very disadvantaged, disenfranchised individuals in one of the poorest parts of the country, losing their money, their livelihoods on machines and getting nothing back in return. And I thought there was something particularly cynical and perverse at this deliberate targeting of very addictive machines in the most economically deprived communities in this country. I knew there was something really wrong about that. And the third anecdote relates to a film, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but I think it's not irrelevant to our conversation today, this global picture. The Big Short on Netflix, that amazing film about the US subprime crisis and its role in the 2008 crash, that whole collapsing of the economic house of cards that we're still recovering from today. And just being struck by how every single analogy in that film about the subprime crisis is based on gambling. And of course, the most obvious thing that had been staring at us all for so long, that what is so often dressed up with the label of the free market is, when you shine that light on it, just a sort of casino economy controlled by its biggest, most powerful players, with careless oversight on the part of regulators and governments, as well as some very powerful vested interests in business, finance, and lobbyists. And I saw those vested interests play out in the FOBD campaign, led by Matt and Carolyn, and others like Tracy Crouch. I saw how much effort it took them to get the government and the regulator to agree to one change on one product, on one type of machine in just one sector of the gambling industry, a tiny speck of sand in the vast context of things. And yet it took them years to move it as if it were as large as a mountain. So I guess what I'm saying is, at the forefront of my mind when it comes to the question of gambling reform, is that it seems to contain so many of the important questions of the age for the Labour Party to think about. It's almost a prism through which the great challenges of the age can be defined. And I wrote a list of what I think some of those challenges are. I'll quickly run them off. When you think about remote gambling, debt, financial harm, economic deprivation, addiction, the question of toxic products, public health, the relationship between freedom of the individual and the state, the balance of regulation, how far the state should go in intervening in the lives of others, the regeneration of deprived cities, the cautionary tale of Blackpool's super casinos, seaside piers, the questions of big data, big tech, privacy, online harms, surveillance capitalism, the work of academics such as Shana Zupoff, the taxation of those companies, often based offshore, what the government has tried to change with its digital services tax, the monopolization of the market through mergers and acquisitions, the challenges to competition law, football, the importance of football in the cultural lives of individuals, the money that is gained through gambling sponsorship and advertising in the nation's favorite game. Gambling is like a prism through which a whole nexus of interlocking issues relating to capital, the state, and harm can be understood. And it seems to me that if the Labour Party does not have something to say about that, then frankly, what does it have to say about anything at all? And I have to say that Tom Watson, whatever you think of him in terms of his relationship to the party, that's not relevant today. When it comes to gambling reform, Tom really got this. He understood the big questions and the points of connection between them. He and I would talk about online harms and surveillance capitalism and addiction by design and big tech. And we tried to articulate those huge interlocking, almost existential issues into very specific agendas of policy reform, limits to stakes, affordability checks, as Matt Zarb-Cousin has referred to today, an ombudsman, an audit of white labels, a statutory levy for research and treatment, a change to the licensing arrangements and an overhaul of the existing regulatory framework. All those ideas came from the Labour Party through the office of Tom Watson and Carolyn Harris and in the joint review with Jonathan Ashworth. All of them, every single one, has since been adopted by the Conservative government and DCMS in the terms of reference of the Gambling Act review. So my advice to the Labour Party now would be twofold. First, keep in mind this big picture and encourage government to approach this question in a holistic, creative way. We have at the moment the Gambling Act review. We also have had a review of online harms through the work of Damien Collins. There's a proposed fan-led review on football governance. The Gambling Commission and the Information Commissioner's Office are collaborating on questions of data, GDPR and privacy. The CMA have looked at these questions too. The NHS has an addiction strategy. I would argue that there is an opportunity for Labour, for creative parliamentarians and policymakers to identify opportunities to connect these various reviews, these various things, and ensure that they speak to each other in the same time frame. The risk otherwise is they all go off in different directions. And the beauty of that is that with the exception of the addiction strategy, all of these various reviews have oversight in the same department, DCMS. So there's a very clear window of opportunity there for the shadow DCMS team to reshape the policy landscape, to have a strong vision of what we mean by gambling reform. And second, and finally, I'll conclude here, it seems to me that Labour can always do more to own its own legacy, to identify the policy areas in the review's terms of reference and draw on the work of the past 5 years to hold this review, to hold the government to account. We can discuss today what the priorities might look like, but I would argue at the top of the list should be the issues of game design, the connections between gambling content and gambling harm, the call to apply limits to that content, and advertising as well, and the question of customer redress, that case for a gambling ombudsman. The Labour Party has already made the case for these things. It now needs to be refreshed and reiterated so that gambling reform is not just something that mattered in the party's past, but also matters in the future.
Thank you, James. That was excellent. I thought I'd give you a little bit of, I'm going to open up to questions in a minute, but I thought just for you to, those who don't know the work that, that Matt and I started, Matt started a long way before we met me, but when he came to the stage when he needed a parliamentary voice. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of an update or give you a little bit of background on how this woman from Wales who never had any thoughts on gambling other than to put a bet on the Grand National and that kind of thing, why I've become so passionate about it. And I was, when Matt came to see me and he started to talk to me about the damage that these machines were doing to individuals' lives, it was something as a working class woman from a working class constituency where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of unemployment and a lot of frustrated people who maybe are looking for something and they don't know quite what they're looking for, but they haven't got a lot of money to do much about these things. And when he started talking to me about this clustering of bookies with the fixed odds, that really resonated with me, because even though in my own constituency there is only sort of one main sub-town, if you like, from the city, I could remember looking in my mind's eye and seeing quite a lot of bookmakers, especially of the same company on that street. And I remember thinking, when I'd seen them, thinking, why on earth would you want to have 2 or 3 of the same bookies on the same street? Surely they're in competition with each other. And it was coming up to Christmas when I spoke to Matt, and I came home and we had somebody come to my office and they said that they'd lost their wallet. And my staff did what we always do when people are in trouble. We went and got him food and got him toys for his kids. And that Christmas day, I went to the pub to pick my husband up, and I was giving one of the old people a dinner. So I took the dinner to the pub. And when I went in to give it to the gentleman, this chap would come to the office, was actually playing the Bandit. And I said to my husband, does he normally come in here? And my husband said, no, he's normally in the bookies. But because the bookies is shut because it's Christmas Day, he comes in here then. And then when I said to my husband the things that Matt had been telling me, my husband wasn't shocked. He was like, oh, well, I knew that. And I was like, well, why didn't you tell me? And he said, well, you never show an interest in gambling. The pub was next door to the bookies, and he was telling me stories about people who'd been made redundant and they'd gone and spent £7,000 in 4 hours in the bookies. And then when I started getting interested, and he started saying to the boys in the pub, or the missus is doing this, or the missus is doing that, or they'd see me on telly shouting about this is wrong and that's wrong. They used to say to him, tell your missus to hurry up and get this sorted, because as long as I'm allowed to do this, I'm going to do it. And that to me was the crux of this issue. It's not about people having individual responsibility. We've all heard those arguments where, you know, they say to people, you were the person gambling, you need to be responsible for that. We're talking about people who've crossed over that threshold. You wouldn't say to an alcoholic or to a drug addict, you need to be responsible for that. You understand that they have a dependency on a substance, which is the only thing that keeps them going. Gambling is like that. Gambling is a drug. It is as serious a drug as anything else you want to think about. And I'll get criticised by people from across the house. I get criticised by the industry, as does Matt, as does James. And I suppose you should grow a second skin. You don't, because you know you were doing it for the right reasons and you get abused for the wrong reasons, and that's because of profit. But the one thing, huge thing I've learned about this community, because we've become a community now, we all know each other, we all talk to each other, is that we've got each other's backs. And we've all got each other's backs because we are doing the right thing for the right reasons. We're not anti-gambling, we're not prohibitionists, we're not trying to take anybody's job or business away from them. We just want to make sure that everybody who comes in touch with this industry can be guaranteed that their involvement with them will be safe, will be monitored, will be affordable, and that they won't be in a position where they are exploited and, let's be honest about it, groomed into putting themselves into a situation where they lose control of their finances, their dignity, and their life. And that's why we do what we do. So on that note, I'm going to open to questions. I'm sure Matt and James are looking forward to asking all your questions. I don't know where I'm going to get these questions from, Abraham, so I'm hoping somebody's going to give me guidance here. But any questions, now's your chance to ask. Somebody said, so where does football come into this? Matt, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, football and gambling have become really inextricably linked over the last 15 years since the liberalisation of advertising came in in 2007. And now we're in a situation where just 4 clubs in the Premier League and the Championship don't have any gambling sponsor or partner. So it's overwhelming. And I think what's happened since then is we've learned the impact, not just of gambling and the causes of gambling harm from a sort of public health perspective, but the impact of advertising particularly. Look, it's no surprise or shock that that advertising tries to influence consumer behaviour, tries to influence public perception and their subsequent attitudes and feelings towards a particular product. That's what all advertising does. And we know advertising impacts children more than it does adults, and children are more susceptible to that. The consequences of tying gambling and a gambling brand to a football club that a child already has an affinity, a pre-existing affinity with, means that that impact of advertising is exponential on that child. There's children growing up now, there's studies in Australia that have been done. Australia, by the way, have banned advertising associated with sports clubs. There's research that shows that children as young as 6 know how to put a bet on. They're growing up thinking that you have to bet on the game in order to enjoy it, that betting is part of the game. More recently, we've seen some of the big clubs Arsenal, I support Arsenal, 16 million followers on Twitter, putting out sports bet links saying, why don't you bet on Aubameyang to score first, acting like gambling affiliates. And obviously these accounts are followed by children. So look, I think there's a big problem in the sense that 450,000 children under 18, obviously people under 18 gambled last year. And there are 55,000 children that are addicted to gambling in Britain. So it's a big problem, and it's storing up problems for the future. And I think that one of the things that Carolyn is going to be leading on next month is working out how we can move away from a situation where football is sharing in obviously the harm and the profits of the gambling industry, and if there's other alternative funding models that could replace that. So that's something that's obviously going to be in the pipeline, but we want to ensure that in any kind of policy response, we foreground the public health aspect, but obviously make some kind of alternative arrangements or suggestions for how that might be replaced, so football doesn't lose out.
Right, hang on, sorry about that, someone knocked on my door. Right, and the next question is, please could you give us a timeline on the review and when we could expect it? James, maybe that's one for you?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball that can give a precise timeline, but my understanding is that, and following sort of normal procedures in this kind of thing, that you've got the call for evidence. Evidence will be submitted. The deadline is at the end of March, and I urge everyone on this meeting, if they want to submit evidence to that review. The evidence is then assessed by DCMS, so the civil servants of DCMS and other government departments, so I'm sure will also have an interest in that process. There'll be a sort of process of collating the evidence and coming up with some key issues that will be put forward to consultation. So there'll eventually be a white paper produced, which is a sort of summary of the government's position. That'll probably be around the autumn. So there'll be another consultation process on the recommendations put forward by government. When that concludes, we'll finally have the consultation, the white paper, on the basis of the evidence following the review, and then it'll be put forward to the necessary legislative or the proposals for legislative change, which will also take time, but which will almost certainly happen in 2022. So I would imagine that the whole process, from the beginning of the call for evidence for this review, right the way through to if we're going to see changes to legislation, will be about 2 years. And I'd expect to see things begin to take concrete shape at the end of 2022. It's a long process.
It is a long process, and the amount of work that goes into getting us to the stage that we're even at now, You would not believe how long it's taken us. Somebody else has just asked a question, which I'm happy to have a go at answering, which is, do we need an ombudsman? And that's come from Harry Shackleton. I would say yes. And the reason why, Harry, we need an ombudsman is that currently people who have an issue with the industry and the way that they've been dealt by the industry have got no way of getting that point of view across. They can go to the Gambling Commission, and good luck with that one. But we've actually taught people now that if they CC me into their complaints, lo and behold, they get an answer. So I've become sort of a quasi ombudsman in actually dealing with agencies to try to get some retribution for those affected. We need to have an ombudsman so that somebody can look at this impartially, and that they are not influenced by the industry, that the money that we do get out of the industry, they'll have no say in where it goes like they have now, and that we can start seeing people who have become victims of this industry actually getting back some recompense for the damage that that industry has caused for them. Another question, maybe, I'm not sure who wants to answer this one, is about planning. There's a couple on planning, actually. Matt, are you happy to answer planning ones? Somebody wants to know, Anne-Marie Pritchard wants to know, can the arguments for planning perspective to limit outlets in particular, like the new one case James mentioned? And David Green is saying, currently gambling outlets are in the same category as banks, building societies and post offices, meaning that planning is not needed to open in a gambling operation. So I'm going to leave those two for you to answer.
Yeah, sure. So like we had this problem with fixed odds betting terminals is that they were obviously in the same betting shops in the same category as A2 financial services, so they could just convert any premises that was sort of below that category to a betting shop quite easily without even having to get planning permission. My understanding was the government switched it to sui generis, but I don't know if that was certainly the intention, but our focus was on the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals because we understood that they're only allowed 4 per shop of these machines. So they're opening up as many shops as possible. And the hope was that all of the shops that are clustered together to facilitate more of these machines would, that there would be less need for all of these shops, and therefore they would stop opening so many, and the clustering would sort of be solved over time. I think the issue really is the tension between planning and licensing, because you can strengthen planning powers, and you can say, okay, if you had betting shops in its own use class, and whenever you switch to a betting shop, you have to apply for planning permission. If the licensing authority still has to aim to permit, which is what the Gambling Commission requires, that the licensing authority should aim to permit gambling licenses subject to reasonable consistency with the licensing objectives, which is what we have at the moment, then it's difficult to prove that the licensing objectives in the Gambling Act, which are fair and open, not associated with crime, not harming the young and vulnerable, would be breached by a premises that hasn't opened yet. And that's where the gambling industry is able to win these cases. When these cases go to licensing hearings, they say, you've got no evidence that this particular premises is going to cause a problem. That's why when the only times that licensing authorities have actually had some success is where there is actual you can geographically demonstrate if this shop is like, near a school or something, or near a mental health clinic or whatever, you could geographically demonstrate that would be a problem in harming the young and vulnerable. But if we introduced, for example, a new licensing objective that was to protect the public from harm, that it was a public health objective that recognized that everyone is at risk of harm, that would strengthen licensing authorities to refuse these applications. So I'm going to come back full circle. Really, the public health objective and the public health reorientation of the legislation will help local authorities reduce these types of outlets. It's not, I don't think, a planning issue, it's more a licensing issue.
Thanks for that, Matt. Martin Jones wants to ask about overall economics. So do you want to type that in the box, Martin, and I can ask the question. David Green, you're asking about loot boxes. It can't be included in the review because currently loot boxes are not seen as gambling. We know they are, but there has been a separate consultation which has had over 30,000 submissions. And hopefully most of them are saying that this is a way into gambling, that loot boxes should come under the gambling review, but it is something that we are looking at really closely. Right, Neil Challen wants to know, do all the areas looked at by the consultation require legislative change under the new Gambling Act, or will some changes, such as affordability checks, James, simply require the Gambling Commission to set out new rules to the licence holders, and thus they will come in much more quickly, probably this year? James, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I will. And at some point, Karen, I'd also like to touch on this debate about freedom that I saw was raised by Kishan Patel, because I think it's a really important one, because a lot of us are accused of being nanny statists by some of the vested interests connected to the industry. It's the $1 million question. What requires changes to primary legislation? What can be done through statutory instruments, so changes to secondary legislation? What can be done by the regulator without any changes to legislation at all? And I won't take up everyone's time with going through the entire list and saying what needs what. And there are some elements of the review that it isn't clear what needs what. I think to highlight an example of where potentially changes to legislation would be required, we would look at the question of stake limits and game design. So at the moment, the parameters that are set around types of gambling content in a land-based setting are enshrined in the 2005 Gambling Act, so they're enshrined in the legislation. So how much you can stake on those games, what the prize is, what the venue is, where they can be, what the speed is. We have a very densely populated framework of protective measures enshrined in the legislation when it comes to products offline. And the irony is, and this is why we talk about the fact that the Act is not fit for the digital age, we don't have anything which is equivalent in the online sector. So, for example, the big debate around FOBTs and what the limit to stakes should be, that required changes to legislation. That's why it was such a hard fight. That's why it took so long. Well, we don't have anything equivalent online. So if we're arguing for equivalent stakes to be applied to online content, it is almost certain that would require changes of some sort to the existing legislation. And that's precisely why Tom Watson, in a speech that he gave in February 2019 at IPPR, advocated the introduction of an E category. So you have your A category, your B category machines, C and Ds. Tom always said, look, we can't talk about changes to speed and to stake of online content unless we have an equivalent category enshrined in the law. So in answer, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully gives you an example of just one small element of the review and quite how complex those legislative questions are around that. With affordability, just very quickly, that's not, well, the controversy around affordability is it's being looked after at the moment by the Gambling Commission's current consultation on customer interaction as opposed to the review proper. So that is something that potentially the regulator could implement without changes to the existing legislation. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, James. Eileen Driver, can Labour accelerate action with an early day motion, e.g. on advertising? Yeah, Elaine, can I just say something? That EDMs are political confetti. They're not worth the paper they're written on. It's only about just saying, getting a point. I mean, if you notice, the SNP write most of the EDMs. They don't actually do anything. They don't change anything. I don't even sign them. It's just about getting a message out there, but it cannot change legislation at all. So no, the answer to that is no. Nick Phillips, one for you, Matt, I think. Do you think the Gambling Commission should be looking to reduce the amount of licenses issued and specifically banning affiliates and white label companies, especially as they appear to struggle with controlling the amount of licenses they currently have in place?
Yeah, absolutely. Just so people who don't know about white labels, there's quite a lot of the companies, the gambling companies that sponsor the shirts of football teams in the top 2 divisions, I think with the exception of like 32 Red and Bet365, all of them are pretty much offshore white label operators. So instead of holding a full gambling commission license, they'll be able to effectively subsidiaries of almost a licensed wholesaler. The two big ones are Vivaro and TGP, and they've got lots of brands that basically buy in to their overarching license. So it's called a white label. And many of these companies don't actually have much of a UK presence. They're actually orientated towards the Far East and countries that actually don't allow gambling and have banned gambling advertising. And of course, if you advertise on the front of a Premier League football shirt and Premier League is shown all around the world, you're immediately bypassing any domestic or native advertising restrictions, because people are seeing that on the screen and they're seeing the brand, and very often it's in Chinese writing on the shirt. So I mean, it couldn't be more obvious about who their target market is. So the Gambling Commission I think they made a mistake allowing white labels. I think they should get rid of those, so we have proper oversight of who these companies are, who's behind them, what their operation is, that there is a proper license reviews can take place, and we know that there's, so that we know that they're not abusing these companies, these vehicles, for things like money laundering and criminal activity. I think all of these things need to be looked at much more closely. I don't think there was adequate due diligence that took place in 2014 when we started licensing online gambling in Britain. Before then, it was a free-for-all pretty much. I think a lot of licenses were approved then that perhaps shouldn't have been. And I think since then, although it's got better in recent years, I think it's fair to say that it's been too easy to get a license. And I think actually we've got such a broad spectrum of operators now, many of them are white labels, that I don't think the Gambling Commission is adequately resourced to do the necessary due diligence and oversight for such a broad spectrum of licensees. So yes, in answer to your question, there's too many operators are licensed. Absolutely.
Right, Alex Reeves. This is a cracking one. This is. Which operators do you feel are doing the right thing, and which operators are the worst offenders? They're all one as bad as the other. Matt, go on, you're going to take that.
Well, look, I mean, I touched on it earlier. 60% of the profits online are coming from 5% of the customers who are addicted or at risk. So if you reduce gambling-related harm, you're going to reduce profits as an operator. Now, which operator is going to want to do that unilaterally, knowing that by doing so, they're going to lose competitive advantage and they're going to lose market share to other operators? So Carolyn, myself, and James Noyes were very, very, I'd say, cynical about the capacity of operators to actually make progress in this area voluntarily. And that's not because they're bad or good, it's just the commercial reality. It's capitalism, and it's why we need regulation. And that's why we focus our attention not on trying to convince operators to do the right thing, because we know that that's commercially impossible for them. We focus our attention on changing the law and changing regulations, so they have to. So the playing field is level, and the consumer benefits from that.
There is another side to that one, and I spoke to somebody who started a gambling firm a good few years ago, and he was talking about reputational damage, and his thinking is that when somebody like him starts a gambling company, they're looking to make sure that in 10, 15, 20 years time, that company is still offering good practice, has a good reputation, is not seen to be fined for misdemeanors continually, that they're making a profit, but they're doing it in a way which is holistic then, if you like. But the problem is, when you have people who are account managers, they thrive on next month's bonus, and next month's bonus is dependent on this month's punters. So they have got a different motivation. They're not really worried about 10, 15, 20 years time, what's going to happen there. They're more concerned about, let's get as much money out of this poor bugger today, because next month that's my holiday money. And that's a huge part of the problem, is that the senior management, shareholders or whatever, whilst I'm not giving them a get out of jail card, I do think that a lot of this is driven by those who are running the account. So that's my interpretation of it.
Caroline, can I also say, just before we move on, if I may, about which operators do the right thing, which ones do the wrong thing. I think one thing that's sometimes lost in the debate is these are big companies, and you will often have internal disagreement within those companies, which no one from the outside ever sees. So I've had pretty good dialogue with the industry over the past 2 or 3 years, and have had meetings with fairly senior industry people, and it's always struck me that when we talk about the gambling industry, we sometimes overlook the differences between sectors, and within sectors, the differences between companies, and within companies, the differences of internal dynamics. So I'm not going to name names, that would be improper for me to do so, but I could give you an example that there is one very large operator, remote operator that I know about, where at the highest level, so C-suite level, there is a very serious disagreement at the moment over the question of affordability. So there will be very senior people in that operator who think there has to be some sort of frameworking around affordability thresholds to protect their customers. And there are others within that company who disagree with that, and they have that debate internally, and we'll see where that debate goes. But I think it's not always helpful to talk about a large multinational, multi-million, multi-billion dollar or pound company as being a single entity. There's always division within companies, and that's why I've always tried to maintain some degree of dialogue with the industry to try and encourage those genuine reformers within those operators to try and achieve change from within their companies, and not just through the pressure of people like Carolyn and her peers in Parliament.
James, can you look at Martin Jones's question on the chat, and Keishan has come up with, give him an answer, and then maybe Matt, you can answer Elaine, who's saying, can Labour do more to illuminate to the public the nature of gambling addiction? I heard a retiring judge say recently it's the worst addiction of all. The public don't understand it. What can Labour do? And does the panel think the present review is worded clearly enough? The language is so clunky and jargon written that I'm struggling to answer it. Is this going to give a fair result?
Yeah. So, Carolyn, on the tax question, with all due respect to you as chair, I think Matt's better placed to answer that because Peanut Gambling commissioned some work a few months ago, didn't they, Matt, about corporation tax and those questions. But I'm very happy to talk about the sort of wider economic question around freedom that was asked earlier after Matt's touched on tax.
Okay, over to you, Matt.
Sure, yeah. So I think I'm going to go in reverse then. So, yeah, I think Labour should be doing as much as possible following in Carolyn's lead. We know the government's going to reform gambling. This is, as James said, this is Labour's legacy. And I think it's really important that we do as much as we can to highlight the risk of gambling addiction. On the review, please everyone submit to the review. Submit evidence, your own experiences, your opinions. Don't feel like you have to answer every question. I think there's several dozen questions on there. I don't know how many exactly, I think 45 maybe, but you don't have to answer all of them. Just submit, it's an email response. It's not a long form. There are some questions on there. Answer the ones that you think you know about, and that'll be very, very helpful. On the tax
BGC are asking everyone to do it on a video. They've asking everyone who even thinks about gambling. So yeah, you must put a response in.
Yeah, absolutely. On the tax issue, so there's two elements to this. Firstly, many of the gambling operators are based offshore, not just the white labels. Some of the brands that we know, you will have heard of, Ladbrokes, Coral, the Entain brands, based in tax havens, based in the Isle of Man, Malta, Gibraltar, William Hill's based in Gibraltar. So they avoid UK corporation tax. These licensees, obviously they pay remote gaming duty, a percentage of the profits that they generate from online casino and online betting. but they avoid UK corporation tax by being based offshore. So there's the tax aspect, the fact that that money is going out of the country. There's not been, there's not the employment benefit if they're based offshore because they're employing people abroad, and also we're having to pick up the tab for the cost of all the gambling-related harm and the social and economic consequences domestically. The other aspect is the fact that spend on online gambling doesn't generate as many jobs or as many economic multipliers as other leisure sectors. So in terms of the economic yield, the gross value added of online gambling is very, very low. So if that excess online gambling spend that has arisen from a lack of regulation and liberalisation was spent in other leisure sectors, in other areas of the economy, it would be more productive and it would generate more tax. So the economic argument that's been put forward by gambling industry lobbyists, I'm afraid, doesn't really stand up to scrutiny whatsoever, even the slightest scrutiny. We need to look at this from a macro perspective.
James?
Yeah, that's a useful bridge, Matt, talking about the question of economic yield, because it touches on these wider questions of the economy, and Kish's question about economic freedom. Are we nanny statists? Are we trying to advocate unnecessary infringements on the liberty of individuals in the free market? And certainly I've been accused of that following the report that I wrote last year, in some of the kind of responses that we saw from some of the industry voices. So economic agency and freedom, this libertarian approach, and I don't want to kind of go into too many historical details, and you'll be more than familiar with them already, but that Chicago School of Economics and the works of individuals like Milton Friedman, when they talked about agency, so he famously talked about the choice that a consumer would have in buying something like a car. So there was a controversy at the time in America that the engines of some cars were more prone to catching fire than others, and the question was, should the government step in and ban those cars? And Friedman made the point famously that no right-minded person would choose a product that could harm them, and in a sense the choice of the consumer regulates the market. There's no need for the state to intervene because the market is regulated by consumer choice, because none of us want to harm ourselves. And I suppose at the time, the 1960s and 1970s, those cozy fireside chats with Milton Friedman in the university corridors of Chicago, that sort of made sense when it came to some products. But in the 21st century, and with the realities of the data economy and what we know about surveillance capitalism, for example, through the amazing work like Zupoff, and I encourage you all to read her book if you haven't already done so, we see fundamental changes to what economic agency and what economic choice means. It's no longer a case of an individual choosing whether or not to buy a car that might or might not catch fire. It's about the digital identity of the individual being harvested or harnessed by the industry, by very large multinational corporations. And that data about the individual, that identity being taken away from the individual and then sold on, or even worse, used to target that individual for commercial gain. So there's something fundamental about economic disempowerment, I suppose, when it comes to big tech and data, that choice and agency is taken away from individuals. And when you look at that in the context of how large some of these companies have become, and the monopolization of big tech, of the data economy, and we know all this through the debate around the social media giants, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples of this world, and a lot of the questions being asked about how they should be regulated. We see a very different landscape from that of Friedman in the 60s and the 70s. What we see is a landscape of a very few powerful actors disempowering the economic agency of consumers in the marketplace. Now, I'm sorry, that is not a free market by any stretch of the imagination. What that is big business replacing the big state. So I suppose the question when it comes to freedom is, sorry, I'm very sorry about this. There's a courier at the door. Please, I'm sorry about this, Karen. One second.
That's fine. That's what happens when you're working from home. I just had somebody knock my door with casework. Nick, I'll answer your question. Nick Phillips has asked about should the unions do more? I would argue that they could do, but I've done a lot of work with the unions, and they will normally. I've done stuff with the TUC. They do try, but they I don't know what more they could do, Matt. Sorry, James, go back to you. You're on mute, James.
I do apologise that one of the perils of working from home, as I'm sure you all know, is you've got 7-year-old children running around kitchens and you've got DHL wanting to drop something off at the kitchen window. So I'm sorry about that. So I was asking the question, is it better to have our economic agency, the oversight of that by big business or by the state? And I suppose that in the realities of the economy today, that's now a false dichotomy. We know that the interests of big business are driven by their profit, and we're aware that there needs to be checks and balances so the state doesn't overreach. But this is precisely why I would argue that it's more important than ever that we understand the role of the regulator, because the regulator, the whole point of regulation, the regulator, is that it is both independent of the market and the state. It sits between the two. It achieves that economic balance. So in answer, Kish, to your question about freedom around gambling today, I would urge you to avoid the sort of false binaries and the dichotomies put forward by some of the libertarians about the fact that it's about the free market against the big state, and focus more on a far more complex question, which is how can digital regulation be effective now in the context of data in the market? And if we can answer that question, I think we go a long way to answering some of the complex questions around remote gambling and prevention of harm.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it on questions. The upside of working on Zoom, James, is that you can wear fluffy slippers and tracksuit bottoms when you're in work, which I did a PMQ in fluffy slippers and tracksuit bottom this week, if only Boris knew. But anyway, thank you all for joining us. It's such a huge subject. It's something which has brought me, it sounds a weird thing to say, it's brought me a great pleasure, not the subject matter, but the community that I've managed to get involved with as a result of that. And I've met some really good friends who I rely on and call on at every given opportunity. So, and I think it's one of those things where your politics doesn't really matter on this one. When you know it's the right thing to do, then you can all sing from the same hymn sheet. So there's a lot of familiar faces on here, which I'm just going to give a quick shout out to, who's doing some brilliant work, and that's James Grimes. And I can see Nick Phillips and Tony Franklin. I can see, well, I'm not at the same screen here. Yeah, people I know, Elaine, I know we've met before, and if I've met you before and I've not recognised you, then I'm sorry. Right, I'm going to go now because the plumber's coming to do my boiler. Exciting life. Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone. Thanks, Carolyn. Cheers.